most people used to draw as kids. Colin Eagan used to make his own board games. So he gets to further his love for information architecture as a principal of ICF International at DC, where he consults for Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, and the federal government clients. Colin is frequent contributor to UX conferences and publications, including UXPA International, IS Summit, UXDC, Confab, Talk, and the UX booth. He credits his career success thus far, for not having gone to law school. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming out here. I'm glad we have sort of a elite group here, so we can hopefully do some questions, and I want to get a lot of feedback of what I'm going to show you guys today. So our topic today is architecting personalized experiences. My name is Colin Eagan. I'm a partner at ICF Next. If anyone's heard of ICF International, it's a large consulting firm in Fairfax. ICF Next is the digital part of the consulting firm. So I do work in user experience and content strategy as part of my day job. Oh, and if you're tweeting along here, I think you know I am Colin Eags, and then you know our hashtag for WIAD19. Okay, so this year's theme is designing for difference, right? So today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about, technically, is it possible yet for what I'm calling the everyday IA, right? Not someone who works at Microsoft or Amazon or Netflix, but regular people, such as myself, to design for the individual, right? Or can you design a personalized experience? So there's no shortage of hype around this. Let me ask you, just show of hands here, how many people have come across and asked for personalization in their job related to something they're doing? Okay, got it, yeah. And how many people are currently doing some official project or digital thing that involves personalization? And, okay, got it, okay, interesting. Yeah, I ask that every time and more hands go up. So, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is what, if you were to Google personalization, most of the results that come back for you are, this is the future, right? But then as the designer, there's not that much you can do with that information. But to give you an example, so here's a report that Accenture just put out, which is a lot of good information. But they say 65% of consumers are more likely to buy from a retailer if they are recognized, remembered, and received in relevant recommendations, which makes sense, right? We sort of have an expectation today of that. Here's another one from Boston Consulting Group, BCG. 800 billion, that's what they're predicting, is the shift in the next 5 years to the top 15% of companies that get personalization right, which is a huge sounding statistic. They have a lot of math behind how they came up with that. There's several, there are a lot of studies out there. If you're interested in the topic, this is another good one to look at. Second annual personalization study by Monetate. They're talking about how everyone they interviewed is actually increasing their directed budgets for personalization in 2018. So, for folks in our field, you're starting to see actual budgets, actual money behind this. And here's an interesting breakdown between who's doing it. They surveyed financial organizations, travel and hospitality, and retail. And they said, do you have any no plans to do a personalization strategy, planning to, just beginning, nearly or fully implemented, and then advanced. And you can see most folks are sort of in the either just beginning, right, or nearly and fully implemented, more significantly for retail, right, which you might expect. But advanced is still very low, right? Most people don't have an advanced personalization strategy. But again, there's not, that doesn't help as design people. That doesn't really help us very much. So there's not much in the way of practical advice for designers. So part one, definitions. So our profession loves right? We love to define things. So what is personalization? So if I had to define it for you, I would do it something like this. So proactively improving the user experience based on some sort of data input, some data we know about the user. And that can be stored, or that can be real time. And we'll talk about kind of what that means. But that's sort of the IA-friendly definition, right? If you're in a meeting with a client or an internal stakeholder, that's kind of how I would, recommend thinking about it. So let me give you an example, and I like this example because it's from a client that perhaps is in a boring industry, which is paper shredding, right? Because I find conferences very defeating when all the examples are, well, Netflix has a proprietary algorithm, why don't you, right? Kind of thing. So anyway, this is Iron Mountain, and they partnered with, some of you guys probably know this from the big bins in the break room that have the lock on them and they cart them off to shred the important documents. That's what they do for a living. And they partnered with a company called Demandbase and a company called Optimizely on personalization. And what they did was they said, okay, here's our homepage. We want to do a web personalization activity. And they said, here's our generic homepage, right? If we don't know who the user is looking at this, if we don't know it's Colin or anyone, we have our general, what you expect, overview of the business. But they also said something that's really key to their business is the type of industry that the user is in. And one particularly, area of difference is healthcare, and you can imagine why, right? Healthcare has so many regulations specific to them that other people don't have to worry about. Finance people have a whole other set of regulations around shredding, right, that they have to worry about, right? So they said, okay, if we could personalize, general term, the website so that actually when I'm arriving here, if we somehow knew Colin was in the healthcare industry, and we'll talk a little later about how we might know that, what could we go ahead and say, right? How could we personalize it? So you can see here, right, they're already saying accelerate your EMR, electronic medical records transition. They have, obviously, the imagery is personalized, right? You get the idea. So anyway, I like this because it's a good concrete example, kind of what we're talking about. And when they did this, it worked really well. So they had a 120% increase in engagement overall, 219 increase in conversions. I don't know exactly how they were just, calculating conversion, and then 78% lift in page views for these targeted healthcare accounts, right? So it worked. So for our purposes here, there are a few things that I would say personalization is not. Customization, changing user settings, that's not really what it is, right? So if someone says, we have a personalization project, but it's really just to give the user settings in a drop-down so they can change the background color. That's not personalizing, that's what we now call customizing, right? That's a separate thing. And then automation, this one's a little more squishy, but creating a rule for things you do often, that's also not really personalization per se. So you can see that it's, the definition is expanding. Now, not so fast. So there are lots of other kind of correct definitions out there of what personalization is, and that's why I think it's really tricky for designers to kind of, nail this down. So many marketers have very different meanings. This is probably hard for you guys to see, but this is an example from a cool company called UXPA, which does personalization exclusively now, so they may be worth checking out if you have a project. And they say, okay, for the whole, the generic sales funnel, right? Someone awareness, interest, decision, retain, right? Our typical commerce flow. How can you, they offer all these services, these little green cards, for different ways you can personalize throughout that experience. So the example we looked at before with the healthcare, that would be, where is it? 7, thank you, on-site personalization. Yeah, includes the ability to present personalized layout, look and feel, right? So that's just one. But you could also do email marketing personalization, right? Most of us are familiar with that. Personalized couponing, that only applies, in certain cases. Mobile, in-store, product recommendations, search, online ad retargeting, shopping cart abandonment, right? So when you start to unravel the thread, it's like, well, okay, if you're asking me, the designer, the IA, to come in and help you with personalization, what do you want, right? Choose a thing that we can then, design to. You have to have a goal. Just saying we're going to personalize overall is not that helpful. So it also means different things to vendors. So I'd be curious if you guys have, worked with any of these folks up here. There's UXPA, who we were just talking about. There's Optimizely, who we referenced earlier. But there's a huge spectrum. These are just a few, right? But there's a huge spectrum of folks out there. Some very big name CMSs, right? Like Adobe's and Sitecors and the Episervers of the world, right? And then a bunch of little kind of cool startups. Optimizely is one that's probably well known, Unless Google Optimize, all saying that they can do personalization for you, right? So again, defining it becomes really important. And as you can see, and this will help illustrate this, if you have a business owner who's asking you how much does this cost, the answer is anything between $49 and more than 1 million. So unless this little company says, for 49 bucks, they will connect the target by location, weather, device, or time. So if you want to personalize for Colin based on where he is here in DC and that it's cloudy, you can spin up a little test for $49. Adobe says they will deliver relevant, engaging, see, it's a lot of the same language, relevant, engaging, personalized experiences by blending rules-driven approaches with artificial intelligence using proprietary Sensei algorithms. That'll cost you up to $1 million a year to license some Adobe products. Does anyone here use Adobe products with a client? Okay, yeah, they're getting much more into this space versus just the Photoshop space that we all know them for. Okay, so that's all well and good. So what does it mean to you? So let's look at, again, if we talk about personalization, and let's break it down a little bit more for IA folks. So I thought this was super interesting. So some, that example we looked at earlier, as many as 45% of orgs have tried to do that in some way, right? Have tried to personalize the homepage now. When I saw that, I was like, wow, that seems like a lot. And here's actually a breakdown, further breakdown of some other things people are trying. So email content, again, has been around forever, right? We've been personalizing emails for decades, for better or worse. So the homepage, now up to 45%. Landing pages, right? This is starting to get a little more specific, 37%. Interior pages, just your average, page, 28%. Product detail pages, blog, navigation. This gets very interesting and very dangerous when people try to start personalizing navigation. It can be done, but it's tricky. Search, a whole nother thing. App screen, so you get the idea, right? One thing I will point out, fewer than a third said that they think it's working of those who said they were doing it. So why is that? So again, this is just sort of another framework to kind of help you guys think through the big picture and maybe orient your current task or the thing you're trying to do around personalization to it. So the reason I think for those people saying, well, we're not sure if it's working or not, it can really mean you can be anywhere on what they're calling a personalization maturity model. Here is one from this company called Kibo. And they basically say, okay, well, the personalizing can mean a lot of things, right? So phase one is sort of your basic recommendations. Then you get into what's called segmenting and targeting. Then you get into machine learning. And then you get into, ultimately, what would be called individualization, right? Which is dumb, because if it's personalized, it should probably be individualized, right? But it's not. Now we're getting all these semantic, breakouts of what personalization means. But that's sort of the Shangri-La, right? That's like what your CMO probably has in mind when they're like, we really need to personalize this. Or not even CMO, when the person comes to you and says, we have a government mandate to make this tax information site personal, right, to the citizen, right? So this is kind of how I would, just to give you a framework, right, to keep in mind, here's an example of that, right? So let's say it's me, I'm on my computer looking for a thing. If we had basic data, whoops, shouldn't have touched that, that makes a noise. If we have basic data about me, right, we might know like I'm in Washington, DC or something. If you were a step further, you could put me into what's called a segment. We'll talk about that. So, maybe male in his 30s or whatever. If you were to do machine learning, right, which is really when I come to your digital thing or your website, stuff I click on where it starts to get creepy, right? Things that I'm interested in, machine learning, could possibly determine maybe I have an interest in user experience, right? He seems to type that in a lot. And then individualization would be really, hi Colin, that's me. I've heard a really good example of individualization recently, which was when you go to a hotel and they say, what type of pillow would you like? That's getting to the individualization level, right? That's pretty advanced. So again, here's our working definition. Proactively improving user experience based on some type of data input, stored or in real time. Any questions so far? Because next I'm going to show you kind of a handy framework, hopefully, we'll see what you think, for how to kind of approach personalization if someone asks you to do it. Any questions? Making sense? Okay. So again, sort of the use case I have in mind here is, what to do when a client or internal stakeholder says they want to do personalization. So let me see a show of hands. How many folks work in-house at an organization or an agency? Okay, got it. And how many are on the consulting side of the business where you're going? Okay, got it. How many are in the category that neither of those describes? What is your role?
Well, I'm here being MBA
Oh,
I'm switching from traditional marketing, which I did in Moscow, to digital. So
awesome.
I just joined my friend here.
Oh, great. Okay. You're just hanging out. Perfect. Hey. So, yes, don't do any of this for a living. You'll be much happier. No, just kidding. So I think hopefully this can apply to sort of both worlds. But I've been kind of working with, I don't know if any of you guys know Jeffrey McIntyre. He works for a company called BucketSmart dude, particularly if you're interested in this personalization space. He was one of the founders of the content strategy movement. He's a really smart guy. So he and I actually were having this problem all the time, separately, where we would go into clients. And most of my clients are more in the commercial space, so the big retailers, big logistics companies. And he has similar. And we were always saying, okay, we get asked for personalization a lot, but it's always so hard to figure out where to start, right, when you're being asked to design that. So we gave ourselves a goal. Could we create a holistic framework specifically for designers, right, who are being asked to do personalization? And this is really what it is. And you're one of the first groups to kind of see this, so I'm interested to kind of see what you think. So this is called a progressive personalization pyramid. And as opposed to all those things we showed at the beginning, right, this is this is like inside baseball, right? This is like what you would need to know as an information architect, the nuts and bolts of actually trying to make personalization happen however you describe it, right? Because there's certain ingredients that you're just gonna have to have, regardless of which of those 9 green boxes, that we looked at before that the client chooses. So it's a framework, not a solution, right? A lot of times you go to a talk and they're like, here's the perfect solution for your problem. And then you're like, I didn't do what I'm doing. It's a framework, right? You'll have different iterations of this. But it helps designers kind of cover the bases of standing up a contemporary personalization program. And I think, hopefully we'll see that it can scale. So what is it? Okay, so it starts really with data, right? The idea is that every place you work for, has raw data, right? There's raw data on all of us floating around based on our interactions, based on everything, right? In order to do something with that, the first thing you need to do is get it to the level of what we would call actionable data, right? So again, like we know Colin is in DC, therefore do a thing, right? That's step one. If you don't do that, everything's just gonna be the same experience for every user. So once we have that actionable data, you can then start to think about your audience, okay? So if we know Colin's in DC, is that helpful to us, right? Can we improve both his experience and ours by showing him something specific to that area? If so, we might want to create a segment, people in DC, right? Just to give a basic example. Okay, so then you have that. The next thing you have to think about is if we now have a segment of people in DC, that's our focus, right? Or that's our personalization. What are we going to say to those people? So if Colin comes on, we want to show him. We might say, we see you're in DC, we have something local here for you, right? And then finally, a touch point would be where that message appears, right? And that's the IA piece. Like, does it appear on my phone? Is it one of those web banners? And then finally, overall, you should be laddering up, and this is where I actually recommend starting, to goals, which are specific and measurable, and then what we call kind of a North Star, which is the overall guiding piece. So that's a mouthful. Let's go through kind of step by step, and again, very curious to hear what you guys think. Feedback is very welcome. So the first thing, again, if someone says, let's personalize the website, you would say, okay, why are we doing this? So setting your North Star and your goals. So the North Star is really what you're aiming for overall with your personalization program, right? And it doesn't have to be huge. I mean, it doesn't have to be every single person is going to get a one-to-one experience, right? It can be something, a little more incremental than that. But sort of the overall guiding piece. I'll give you some examples. And goals are sort of the tactical and measurable pieces around that. So the North Star should be, what do you wish to accomplish? And the North Star will kind of cast a shadow over the project, right? So if you're going like really big with your North Star, like everyone's gonna get personalization, then that's gonna be a lot of work, man. But maybe you're just saying, well, let's just start by, personalizing like they did just one segment on the homepage, and that segment is very important to us. So we're going to start there, and when they come, let's just test that and see if it works, right? So this is sort of the spectrum of constellations, right? Depending on how big you're aiming. So like that small one, right? If your North Star is a function, that would be sort of a smaller, piece. a feature likewise, just like a widget, a personalization widget that you're adding to the website. If you really want to have your whole experience personalized, right, that would be shooting in that area. And then a product, that would be something truly like an Amazon, a Netflix, a Spotify, something whose very essence is personalized content, and there's a lot of proprietary big money algorithms behind that, right? So if you're really shooting for the stars, that's sort of a unique situation. But again, most folks, kind of fall in here. They're saying, we're trying to make things better for our users. Either we're going to spin up a particular application or something, right, that might help with that, or we're going to try to personalize the website, right? Somewhere in between. And then goals, you guys know all about goals, so we won't spend much time on this. But my advice is always tie your personalization program to some measurable objectives, right? Because there are a lot of things that theoretically personalization could improve, right? Time on task, maybe it helps people do things quicker. Conversion, we saw those stats earlier from the demand-based site. Team efficiency, brand perception, you get the idea. But the important part is to choose some goal. Okay. So now we have our goals. So now we're actually going to go back down and look at this part. So this is getting from the raw data kind of to the actionable data. So here are some examples of common data sources. And the good news here is it doesn't have to be terribly complex or terribly expensive. So let's start out. I don't know if you guys in the back can see this. I'll read it out down in this quadrant here. So this is, first of all, we have an access of like the volume of your site or your application, right? So the number of users you get, right? Do you have a ton of traffic, or do you have some lower traffic who's more focused? And then this is session time. How long do your people generally spend looking at the thing that you spend money making, right? Online. So volume. So then let's start over here. So if it's basic self-selection, you could start getting personalization data with something as easy as a quiz or a little profile, right? Something that says to the user, and we're familiar with this, are you a small business or a large business, right? So we're trying to help figure this out. Can you give us some information? Now you're going to have a fair amount of attention from your user in order to do that, right? But it's, you don't have to have a ton of visitors to start figuring that out there. So that's the kind of basic self-selection. If you want to get into basic segmentation, that would be things like geolocation, SIC or NASIC codes. We'll talk about that, but that's how an industry classification source, a campaign source, and again, in that example we looked at earlier with the healthcare, there are third-party vendors who you can buy this information from, right? So in that reason they were able to know that it was healthcare was because the IP address of that company was affiliated with a healthcare organization, right? We're not going to go into that kind of detail, but those are the ways of how they're doing that. So then up here would be what I would call advanced segmentation, clicks or pages viewed, behavioral profiling, and then the big data one-to-one space is truly that like machine learning, right? Having algorithms, learning about your users, and actually forming their own recommendations in the background, which is kind of scary, but kind of cool. So here's that example of the very basic one, right? This is, I think I was on GoDaddy or something trying to get a web domain, and they said, "Hi, Colin. We are working on new ways to give you a more personalized experience. Please tell us, I own a business or a nonprofit. I am in the process of starting a business or nonprofit." None of the above. Very basic example, right? So if you even collected that much information and then started campaigns for people who were nonprofit, or rather owners versus people in the process of owning, that could be a helpful difference to explore from a design perspective. And then on the other end, you have Adobe. This is an example of that very expensive proprietary stuff that I was telling you about earlier. Okay, so now we have the data. So now let's talk about kind of user segments. So I'm going to give you guys some sort of specific examples, and I'm happy to share these because I know it's a lot of text. But again, I'm very big on trying to recommend things you can actually use. This is what I call, it's not complicated, a segments worksheet. So this would be the idea that once we have data, right, we need to kind of figure out who are our segments and kind of what are we going to say to them. So for example, here's our segments here, current members, non-member males, and in this case, non-member parents. This was for a fictional nonprofit site. And then how to identify them, right? What's the data source? So maybe they're logged in that's a great data source, right? If someone actually logs into your site, you can very much personalize on those folks. But chances are, if they're not current members, maybe they're coming in from a Facebook campaign. Maybe they're coming in from an email campaign. You can make a segment based on that incoming data, right? And then you have your goal for what you're trying to do, and then your messaging for what you're trying to accomplish. So again, not terribly helpful, but I would recommend starting there, right? Say, okay, what segments are we trying to reach? So setting up a segment quite literally, and this is just one example from Adobe Target. Is anyone working with a system like this right now, by the way? I mean, these are pretty cool. You can actually go in and set up your segment. This one is from email campaign, right? So if you have your email API or whatever in the background here, plugging in that information, then you can say, you create your segments based on visitor behavior, traffic sources, et cetera. So just to give you an illustration of kind of what that actually looks like. Okay, so start moving pretty fast here, but this next part is about context and campaigns. So this is where you get to the part about what do we actually want to say, right? So we've kind of gone through, we have the data, we've created our segments. So this is a campaigns worksheet. This is taking those segments we identified and trying to figure out through what type of content we would personalize to give that user. So for example, for current members, it could improve their experience if once you logged in, there were links immediately on the homepage for current members, right? Just basic example, versus folks who were there to kind of make them feel interested. So this here, there's, if you're interested in content strategy, this is a personalization content model that I've used before, which is helpful. But it basically shows 4 flavors of ways you can personalize content, right? So you could send someone a personalized alert, like at the airport, right? Your flight, Colin, is ready to leave. You could personalize to make easier. That would be like that example we just gave. And then cross-sell, which of course is the marketing function, right? If we know that you're a non-member male, ages in this demographic, how could we show you a promotion, something we're trying to do specific to you. And then enrich is kind of what I'd call sort of the thought leadership category, if you hear that term, right? Blog posts, just sort of content that you would think is helpful for folks. So again, just a good way of thinking through, the question of, okay, we're showing someone a personalized message. What should that be, right? And it can be a lot of things. All right, so where we say it, these are the actual touch points. So here's an example of, and again, we could just have a basic wireframe for the IAs in the room. How many people are IAs officially? Anyone? Information architects? Yeah, sort of, kind of. How many are user experience people? Okay, most people are user experience, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, you don't see as many jobs for information architects, just that anymore. But if you do wireframes, this is something that I've used, which is handy, right? So you can actually say at a template level or a page level, what part do you want to personalize? And what that essentially means is that this zone, we would call it, right, would be running some logic or rule in the background that essentially says, if that user is healthcare, then show healthcare message here. It's as simple as that. Or more complex, right, if you wish to use different zones in your information architecture. And you can start to think through how, if you wanted to get fancy, you really could create a individualized experience, right? If you have different rules running sort of throughout your design. All right, so let's bring it all together. Again, this is a lot of theory, so let's try to take it back to what that might actually mean. So let's go back to our example, right? Healthcare. Let's say North Star. Okay, so we're the document shredding company. You are the board, the document shredding company. You said we want to do personalization. We all got together and we said, well, why do we want to do this? Well, we want to be a trusted partner for document shredding. That's kind of our North Star, right? That's what's guiding us. Okay, well, that's good. So goals. You say we want to increase engagement by 50%. we want to increase conversions by 30%, and we want to lift our page views specific for this healthcare target by 15%. Okay, I can work with that. Those are very specific goals, right, for a personalization program. So then we say, let's go back down to the bottom. Okay, paper shredding corporation, you have data. People are visiting your site right now out there doing Google searches for document shredding, right? You have all sorts of people coming in all over the place. How do we make that actionable? In this case, they partnered with this external vendor, Demandbase, who used that thing called the SIC code, Standard Industry Classification, to be able to help to classify our incoming traffic into industries. Healthcare people, financial people, right? So that was our actionable data. Our audience segment was healthcare. We said, okay, if we can identify you, our segment will be healthcare. We will personalize for that segment. What do we want to say to healthcare people? And this is where it gets interesting, right? Because usually people haven't thought that far ahead. They're like, oh, well, if you personalize, it just is a perfect personalized experience. Like, no, you got to think about what you would say to Colin if you can speak to Colin, right? So in this case, we say, okay, well, that would be awesome if we can speak to healthcare. We would love to talk about accelerating EMR, because that's what everybody wants, and that's what our competitors are offering. So let's start there. That's very good. So spin up a campaign and get a guy in there and a lady doing medical things related to health records, right? And get the copywriter to write some copy and get the graphic designer to put it all together. So then we have our thing. Okay, so where are you going to show this? Well, I think let's show it on the website, right, just to start out to see. And then if it works on the home page, maybe we'll also put it in other areas of the site. So that's our touch point, our home page banner touch point. And then ideally, you're back up to your goals for kind of where you started. So really, we just have one more slide here, and then I want to get, or a couple slides, and then I want to get your thoughts. So thank you for going all through that. So the final thing to know about kind of the pyramid or the model here, right, for progressive personalization, is everything that we just did would be, again, if you're just starting out, right, with your personalization campaign, right, or you have again, new client, new stakeholder who says they want to personalize. And that's what we would call prescriptive or business-driven, right? That's saying, okay, we know our audience. Let's make some informed assumptions about how personalization could help our audience, right? So that's prescriptive. So that's the business kind of driving that. So on this side, where it comes back down is once you have those touch points in play, and this is where it gets pretty interesting, you can start doing what's called adaptive personalization. Now this is that space where you have to be on these bigger kind of algorithm-based platforms. But again, this is getting very common these days. In that Adobe Experience Manager example, or Adobe Target, essentially, let's say we have that banner, right? In the background, we can start, or these systems can start to give you even more data about who's looking at that, interacting with that banner, right? So these are things that perhaps you never would have thought of. So it could be something like providers in multi-state systems with over 300 patients, right? So there are other data points that the systems can start to mesh, right? So you might say, whoa, I didn't even know that was a thing. We have people like that interested in us who we could talk to as an audience. People who clicked on 2 or more blog posts about this topic, right? You could have, they might define things just related on clickstream type data. Or totally random stuff. People who bought lab coats and shredders in Montana. Well, maybe that's a segment, right? We never would have thought of that as here in the board, but if those people we're finding are coming in high volumes. And then some of the really fancy systems out there today, and this is where it starts to get kind of scary and makes it seem like humans are no longer going to be involved in this equation, are selling the fact that they can also create, the machines can also create the content for you, right? So the machine says, oh, we have all these people buying these shredders. Let's algorithmically put together copy and images and start serving those up and see if we get clicks. If we get clicks, keep doing it. If we don't, throw something else out there, right? So again, this is only a scenario where if you think about that quad or that grid, you would need a lot of traffic, right, to do these types of things. You need high volume. But the good news is, even if you don't have high volume, even if you're just asking a little quiz or for user information, you can still have a compelling prescriptive campaign, right, for personalizing. Okay, so that's really it. There is bonus reading. I wrote an article on this. Do you guys read A List Apart? You should. If you don't, this is kind of Jeffrey Zeldman's blog. It's been around forever. But this is an article you can check out there, which kind of goes through a lot of what we talked through. And then, as I said, Jeff and I, this is a little side project, but if any of you are very interested in personalization, I'd love to get your thoughts. We're thinking of putting together a little card deck that would have different kind of flavors of cards, for the different levels of the pyramid. So if you want to check that out, again, it's easy to progressivepersonalization.com. There's a tiny little form there. We'll just add you to a list and send you a prototype if you're interested. So it's progressivepersonalization.com. Okay, so we have, I think we have 15 minutes. That gentleman just held up a sign. So I know that was a lot. So yeah, thoughts? Any reactions? Do you guys buy this? Does it seem usable? Now the reason I went through the whole thing with you is because you guys are industry people who do this for a living, so you would get it. Obviously doing this with a room full of marketers wouldn't work, right? Because they'd be like, well, I don't care about half of this stuff. I just want you to, sell my thing. Do you think, well, yeah, any reactions in terms of like easy to follow, hard to follow? Yeah.
I just had a question, because it seems like a lot of personalization is around data.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like personalization should be around humans and data.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious your thoughts on incorporating personas when you're doing your user segment.
Yep.
Like it seems like healthcare is a very broad user segment.
Yep.
So personalizing it more like who really cares in the healthcare industry about shredding, and then helping that with your personalization strategy. Have you incorporated personas at all?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good question. So I think for personas, as with kind of this example, they're a really good place to start, for sure. But you can run into what's called the infinite content problem, right? Which makes sense, because you start thinking, okay, let's say I have 5 personas. For each one of those, I need to have a different message. For each one of those messages, I need to have a different version to appear in all of my touch points, right? So if you start doing the math, you can't do it for all of them. So I would say absolutely. I mean, you can absolutely have persona-based segments for sure. But typically in that scenario, it's better to kind of choose your battles, right? So like you're saying, find who's our truly high value target, that we're really trying to reach in this particular quarter or whatever, right? And then kind of spin up something to them. But that also doesn't have to be the case. I mean, one of the things that one of the reasons I think we need a personalization framework in our industry is personalization is more than marketing, right? Or it should be. And that's the thing that drives me nuts whenever I go to other conferences, and personalization is all about just, selling people stuff that they don't really want, right? It's like there's a lot of it should be, about making the user's job better. So yeah, I think you're right. I think starting with segments and figuring out kind of what's that, overall segment worksheet, what's that framework, and then if you're lucky enough to have a big data platform, you can discover, again, segments, personas you never may have even thought of. Yeah?
Can you tell us something about ethics around collecting data while personalizing experiences?
Mm-hmm.
Because Adobe Target and these other tools optimize user testing. They come with a set of disclosures.
Yep.
But when you're in DC, if you have a federal client, what are the things you need to keep in mind when, as designers, where information is exchanged?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Personalization for the federal space would be a very interesting topic. You should write about that if that's where you work. So the basic thing, which everyone's probably seen, is the cookie notice. So every website now, because they passed legislation in the European Union recently, which is more forward-thinking typically than we are here, saying that you have to at least acknowledge that cookies, are running in the background, because that cookie thing is a major source. I mean, you're going to drop a cookie to say this person is healthcare, right? If we've identified a person as healthcare. So yeah, I mean, there's the ethics of all this. Absolutely is a whole nother topic and something that is missing from the conversation. I always start from the point of view of user-centered design and saying, are we legitimately trying to help someone by personalizing their experience, right? And I think if you can answer that question honestly, and the answer is yes, then you're in good stead. Other specific examples are giving the user an opportunity to opt out, right? Is very important. A lot of these now you'll see. If you get the user, it's called a personalization bubble. Sometimes you can get trapped in the wrong persona or segment. Being able to say, this is not me, right? Or stop doing this. Stuff like that, I very much advocate. People don't always listen to me, though. I think we got time for one more question, yeah?
I was curious, so for organizations that are embarking on a prescriptive journey, maybe they're on that red or magenta pyramid, what kind of skill sets do you think they're best served developing internally versus outsourcing or working with another company?
Man, okay, you guys are asking all the big questions. This is the thing where you could do a whole nother talk on staffing around personalization. So yeah, I would say, I mean, what I can tell you from working at some larger companies, Fortune 50 type places, are actually starting to have roles around, personalization architect, or people who actually, typically it's an amalgam of someone from a, marketing background plus sort of a UX and analytics background. But absolutely, if you are, to go jump back to our little slide with all the vendors on it, if you're really just trying to spin up a, test, there are a ton of players like the Unlesson, the Monitates, and Google Optimize. Evergage is worth checking out, who can really kind of, it's more of that, click one and done type model. Now, what they'll do is they outsource the personalization, for lack of a better term, right? Like you say, here's my little piece of the website, right? Go do your magic in the background and send me in real time a personalized thing, right? Whereas these guys, this is very much you are owning the personalization right in your content management system, right? They're giving you full access. So to answer your question, if you're really, trying to staff up around it, you might want to start here. And again, the typical skill sets would be, you want to have some marketing person involved, some designer, obviously, and then your analytics team, and certainly your dev team. Another cool, reason I like personalization, or this whole waterfront, is it really does force a lot of people to work together. Right? Like it's one of those like come together areas, because you got to have marketing, you got to have design, you got to have tech, you got to have, in a good scenario. In a bad scenario, you just have marketing and tech, and then everyone else is screwed. One more quick question.
Semi-related to that.
Uh-huh.
So if you're going back to your slide with experience, product, feature, and whatnot, let's say if you're developing personalization for something at more of a product level, what have you seen more like in-house development of that personalization?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Definitely. Yeah. If you.
Oh, sorry, experience level.
Oh, the experience level. That can depend. This is where you are starting to get more in-house, right? The feature or the function is more kind of the one-off, where you're saying this widget thing, let's spin up a test. Once you start to get here, that's probably going to be more in-house effort, right?
Because it's so hard to compete with other companies like Amazon and Netflix to get the talent to develop it in-house.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I was
Yeah.
wondering what you've seen.
Yeah. You mean just from a development standpoint?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, the development here, I mean, it's a lot of systems architecture, API interfaces, a lot of big data kind of stuff, right? Those types of skill sets, but not on the level of these guys. I mean, you don't need to have, an in-house team of, Java developers just to, spin up one of these things. I mean, it's, if you're at this level, you can do it more modestly. But it's another area too, right? Where it's like you can't go out and find a personalization developer. I mean, you're going to still find people developing in whatever language, and then it's just, depending on what your experience needs to hook into. Okay, all right. Well, I think we are about out of time, and it's time for lunch. So thank you guys for humoring me and listening to this. And as I said, progressivepersonalization.com I'm Colin Eagan on Twitter. I would love to hear from you. Thanks a lot.